Good morning and welcome to this policy dialogue on the EU-China strategic partnership. Apologies for the slight delay in starting, but I think we'll have a very interesting discussion today. Thank you to the EU-Asia Center for co-organizing it. And I think clearly we have a lot of things going on at the moment in the EU-China partnership. So there are a lot of topics we will cover today. I want to bring in the audience as well at a later stage. So if you do want to ask any questions, if you want to make any comments, then there are two ways of doing that. Either there's a hand symbol, which you can use to indicate that you want to speak. I will then identify you by name and we will unmute you once we come to that question. Or you can write a question in the questions box and I will try to bring it into the conversation. But please do not write long questions. It's very difficult for me to then see them, so keep them brief and to the point. But without further ado, I think we'll start with a general overview of where we are at in the EU-China partnership, what is happening, what are the opportunities, but also what are the challenges which we are facing at the moment. And I will start with Fraser Cameron, Director of the EU-Asia Center.
Thanks, Fabian, and it's a pleasure to work again with the EPC on this event. I think in a nutshell, the policy paper of last year of the EU, which described China as a strategic rival, which everyone focused on, but people also forget the partner aspect of it, as well as the economic competitor. And that essentially still holds, although I think the situation overall has slightly hardened towards China as a result, particularly of events in Hong Kong and some other activities. But I think the mood, and we saw this just a couple of weeks ago at the EU-China summit, was one of trying still to work out where we can engage with China. I mean, China is coming up to be the largest economy in the world. We simply can't ignore China for so many global issues, whether it's climate change or regional security issues such as Iran, that we have to find a way of working with China. And we are not going to enter into a kind of containment operation that characterizes, I think, much of the United States policy just now. So the EU position is to say, let's stand up and defend our values. And that's what I think von der Leyen and Charles Michel were emphasizing it 2 weeks ago, taking a stance where necessary on these issues. And at the same time, looking for areas to cooperate with China to tackle some of these major issues. And I think now, obviously, the pandemic and the global economic recovery are two priority areas where the two sides could and should be doing more together. But at the moment, there is still some suspicion, partly because of disinformation activities, partly because nobody quite knows how we should move forward in the few months before the presidential elections here, because that will have an impact also on our relationship. So there's a number of uncertainties in the air just now. But overall, I think the EU still wants to view China as a strategic partner to move forward in areas where it can, but also to defend its interests on trade, values, etc. So that's my quick assessment where we are now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fraser. Now turning to how does that look like from the Chinese perspective? Is there a willingness to deepen the relationship? What are the frictions which are there? And I'll turn to Hongjian, who's the Director for Europe at the China Institute of International Studies. Sorry, I don't have any sound at the moment. No.
That's okay?
Now it's okay. Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you now.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to share some perspective, especially from myself, about how could we understand the current situation, China-EU strategic partnership, and also what could we do. I think firstly, I agree with Fraser that so far for both sides, I mean China and the EU, still a bigger problem of perception. I think still from China's perspective, still concentrate on this so-called four, different definition from European Union side on China, especially this systemic rival and economic competitor, everything. So I think now the first question for China and EU is we need to find out the how to say mutual accepted perception, especially how could we understand this systemic rivals, and otherwise I think there will be always some barriers for the mutual trust in future. Now, secondly, I think that now for China and the EU, we need to understand how it is important for both sides to keep this, resilience. I understand that resilience recently is a very, very hot issue, hot concept for European Union side. But I think now I would like to introduce this concept into the China-EU relations, especially in the face of China-US. I understand that from European side that it looks like there are more and more tensions between China and the US. So what does it mean for EU to find out its own position and its own approach in the competition between China and the US? I think yes, now more and more for China, the European Union and the European countries play a more important role in Chinese foreign policy, not only because of the China-US relations, not only because of the the pandemic issue and other. The third is how could we find some, I would like to say, more synergies between two sides. I think the Chinese side will also take a consideration, take a very, very big concern about some new strategies from European Union. If we look at the recent events, started from the end of last year till maybe the first quarter of this year, how many strategies launched by European Union, by European Union Commission, including this AI, 5G, and Africa, and also the green economy and the digital everything. So I think that now could China and the EU, we can find out a way to have some more cooperation in those new, development, especially according to these new strategies from European Union. For example, China and the European Union, and also some member states of European Union, proposed a cooperation with and in the third parties, especially in Africa. Now Africa become more and more important for European Union and also for China as well. So how could we introduce some cooperation, including the green economy, digital economy, and into Africa? And another issue is how could China and the EU, we can try to manage so-called competitions in some sectors. Maybe we can try to find the way in a third party, and we can also find a new model of this cooperation. Not only just like what happened before, that China will provide some investment and the European side will provide some technology. Maybe we can find a new model for cooperation. So finally, I would like to have a briefly conclusion is, yes, China has more and more willingness to have cooperation with the European Union. But firstly, we need to find out more resilience for these relations. We need to understand the real importance for the cooperation for each side. And the third is we need to try to find a way to overcome any kind of external, influence, especially from this competition between China and the US on the relations between China and the EU? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Turning to Maaike Okano-Heijmans, who's Senior Research Fellow at Clingendael Institute. We just heard about possibilities of cooperation. Do you share that there are some opportunities in these areas which have just been highlighted?
Yes, thank you, Fabian, and also Fraser for having me here. I'm happy to share some thoughts. And indeed, several of the things that previous speakers said were also on my mind in preparing a few words for this. Because on the one hand, I feel it's sort of difficult to be very optimistic with all the news that we've heard in recent months about EU-China relations. I think the summit was a difficult one. Whereas 2020 was supposed to be, of course, a special year for EU-China relations. And it's turning out slightly different than we all hoped, not just because of COVID. And indeed, EU and member states, specific member states, have hardened their approach, you could say, or have come to a more realistic understanding of China and find the need to build that into this relationship, as I would call it, actually. Whereas we're also at the same time, I think, sort of struggling with the fact that for China, Europe is not the most important partner, obviously. This is still the United States. And I think the bilateral relationship is sometimes also suffering from that. The fact that China is mostly focused on the United States, which of course is the key competitor to China in geopolitical hegemony, if you will, and tech rivalry for sure. And then add in the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think is further complicating the relationship because we see an inward focus, both in the EU and in China, and sort of a less appetite for cooperation. So I very much agree that we have to be looking for new areas where we can aim to stay away from that sort of isolationism, if you will. Because we saw China turning inward after the conclusion of the 2 sessions of the Chinese Congress, I think. There it became clear that China was prioritizing internal cycle rather than external elements, so exploring new sort of more of the domestic partners and markets and innovative capacity. And I think it's also an expectation of apparently more decoupling from the world economy, part of the deglobalization trend. At the same time, we saw Josep Borrell, of course, EU External Action Service. He said in rougher seas, the EU's own interests and values should be our compass. And he was speaking sort of in the context of the EU-China bilateral relations, but emphasizing EU's own interests. So we see on both sides turning inward. And what I noticed also in the COVID pandemic sort of aftermath, Chinese side was very much focusing on this new element to its Belt and Road Initiative, the Health Silk Road, which I think is a good chance for China to diversify its cooperation to different areas, different new sector, with the delivery of medical goods and much needed supplies, which at the same time in Europe was received sometimes with skepticism because it also was accompanied in European perspective with an infodemic. The blurring lines between what is donations and what is sales, for example, of medical supplies. So China was focusing on this Health Silk Road, and I think Europe would do well to focus on the digital side. China's digital Silk Road, of course, is Chinese proposal, but in Europe it's digital connectivity. And I wrote a small piece on the coronavirus as the first digital pandemic, which I think should have the EU thinking about the need to invest in digital democracy and digital social innovation. And also in technological sovereignty. That's a word we've heard much more than before, reconsideration of supply chains. So here we see sort of a mismatch, which I think we should be closing, or a gap that we should be closing in EU-China relations, as we try to pursue resilience on the one hand and at the same time should avoid isolationism, So I have, let me conclude with just 3 thoughts, specifically in the digital domain, which I very much agree with Dr. Chiu that we should be focusing on this. I think we need new mechanisms to discuss some of these challenges, because there are very few at this moment. In multilateral institutions, of course, much of this is discussed not just in WTO, but also G20, in the OECD, in the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. And I think for the EU and China to discuss more of their positions will be helpful. Also, more specifically, a new mechanism, secondly, then to discuss on the one hand EU digital connectivity and on the other hand China's digital Silk Road. We know, of course, that there has been an EU-China connectivity platform for many years already, with ups and downs, but that's very much focused on transport. So I think we need something of that kind in the digital field. And then thirdly, I would also say we need a broadening of the human rights dialogue that I hope will still be held in China later this year, also to include digital human rights. So to discuss their diverging and hopefully set at a certain time converging approaches to cyber governance, which I think Europe still wants to very much feel that we should be inclusive and human-centered rather than cyber governance serving the interests of the state, or for that matter, in the US approach, the big tech companies. So Europe has its own approach, and I think to digital freedom of speech, to digital transparency and surveillance technology, these sorts of issues should also be taken up in this digital in the human rights dialogue, I think. And that would be a sort of maturing of the relationship of EU and China into the new domains of this 21st century.
Thank you, Maaike. Maybe to explore a bit further this impact of COVID-19. Clearly, there has been an impact. One of the obvious signs is the Leipzig summit having been postponed. But how deeply is COVID-19 affecting the relationship, also in terms of the longer term? Not just in the short term, where clearly there are a number of restrictions, but is this changing something structurally? Maybe I'll start with Fraser.
I think, as Maaike said, everyone is looking inwards, both the EU and China, other countries too, because the first priority is actually to tackle the implications of the pandemic for their own population. So everyone is rather neglecting the international affairs at the moment. Secondly, I think, as Maaike said, there's a huge area there for shorthand health and digital going together, where we could and should be working together. I mean, there's been a history of pandemics coming from parts of Asia, the SARS before. We need to work more closely to look at, how these originated. There's going to be some inquiry, and what can we do together, not in any finger-pointing way, but trying to look at it in terms of how we can deal with these issues in future. And thirdly, it will depend on how quickly we all recover from the pandemic. I mean, there are signs that China has been pretty effective in combating it and getting its economy moving again. China, by Goldman Sachs statistics, will be accounting for 30% of all global growth in the next 5 years. Well, nobody can avoid the China market there. And I think people will also at the same time be asking questions about, well, how did we get into the position where 80–90% of some of our pharmaceutical products were actually based in China? So I think it's quite a complicated debate going on in future, but these will be the priority areas in terms of the impact of the pandemic and what will be the health aspects. Secondly, the economic prospects for cooperation. And thirdly, new technologies, particularly in the digital area. So that's how I think the pandemic will impact on the EU-China relationship. And the final point is, looking over our shoulder is, of course, what the United States is doing and what pressure they're bringing to bear both on Europe and China in terms of their own agenda.
Kui, just looking at this impact of COVID-19 and also some of the debates we have had globally, where also there has been quite significant criticism of China, not only from the US, but from other points. How does that look from the Chinese perspective? And is this an opportunity for more cooperation, and under what conditions can that happen?
Thank you for this question. I think it's also a very important issue now for Chinese research on Europe. So how could we understand what happened during the pandemic? Especially, it looks like a more misunderstanding between two sides. I mean, between China and the European countries. Maybe certainly there will be some negative impact from this. I would like to say, the battle of the words between China and the US. We can find some spillover effect. Once there are some tensions between China and the US, certainly there will be some response from the European side, especially from medias, from some public opinion. And another issue, I think now we need to understand that the pandemic give a very, very special environment for this people-to-people contact. You can find out there are more, indeed, there are some misinformation and disinformation in some Chinese, especially we call the self-media. In Chinese, we call it 自媒体, which means that's just run by some companies, by some even personal, running, media. So it gives a very, very complicated environment for public opinion. And I think another issue is we can find out maybe a kind of a cultural differences during the pandemic, how to define this crisis and how to deal with this crisis. I think from Chinese culture, maybe perhaps mostly that yes, there is a crisis, but we need to get out from this crisis immediately. We try to find the new way. We try to find the new figure to deal with any, challenges. I think that's a very, very interesting and also characteristic, culture in China. And of course, I think at the same time, most problem for this communications, for some mutual understanding is still I would like to say we lack of the the common context for communication, and we need to understand how could we find out a more connection between maybe two different narratives. For example, from Chinese side, it's a kind of very natural response that yes, now we have this pandemic crisis, but we need to have some more opportunity to promote this the proposal by Chinese leader about the shared future for human community like that. But how could we find this narrative and the narrative from Europe, for example, the international humanitarian, and how could we go to equal cooperation? And it's not an opportunity or any chance for the government to promote its image or like that. So I think yes, it raised a lot of issues for both sides to find out more, maybe deeper, some differences. But now the question is, how could we find out a common understanding? And if we could find out more, common narratives to help this mutual understanding, I do believe that it would be the very important tasks for the think tank like us.
Thank you. Maaike, one of the impacts of the pandemic you've already mentioned is this tendency towards reshoring, or at least the rhetoric towards reshoring. And certainly terms like strategic autonomy or technological sovereignty have been used quite a lot. How realistic do you see this, particularly maybe focused on the digital field, given the current decision in the UK and the implications that will have? Is this really something where we will see major changes in supply chains, or is it more paying lip service, but in reality, the integration is already at a stage which makes it very difficult to see a significant reshoring?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, actually. I think the intentions and the actions towards introducing more resilience in the supply chain is real. It was also already existing before COVID, you could say. And it's not just, it's also impacted by the US-China trade tech rivalry, which is forcing some companies, especially, for example, semiconductors, to move to different places in order to target to markets. So I think some of this is very real. For example, in the pharmaceutical sectors, definitely there's a new realization that we will also have to act in this sector that we hadn't really thought about before. In that sense, COVID is really introducing something new. And the EU, of course, had been thinking for quite some time already about industrial policies. This was also, I think, impacted by some of the consequences of China's Made in China 2025 policies. So I think it's sort of a longer term trend, and COVID is definitely impacting that. But perhaps more importantly, the US-China rivalry is doing that as well. A different point that I would like to follow up also that was just made about EU and China cooperating in third countries, because some of the bilateral issues I think will be difficult to solve or difficult to get to an agreement. And looking at third countries, what is happening there also post-COVID, that might be a sort of also an opening for a new debate to be had. Where we see, for example, in the G20 with this, what's it called again, the debt service suspension initiative, I believe, where some countries that have been specifically hard hit by COVID now received from, I think, May 1st until the end of this year, sort of this debt suspension, and China played a big and a positive role in this. That might be sort of a stepping stone also to look at what the EU and China could do to cooperate to help third countries in these difficult times. And I very much like this suggestion of, we have to move from sort of the EU technology with Chinese investments, because obviously, as we've seen from the medical assistance that China has provided also to African countries, that China has a lot more to offer beyond investments. And to coordinate that a lot better, I think it will be to the benefit of all. It's very much needed also in the regions around Europe. So I would like to, really agree with Dr. Chu here that that's a promising avenue also.
Thanks. Turning to investment, but more specifically on the EU-China relationship, the comprehensive agreement on investment, which has been in the ether for a while. There was a hope to make progress this year and potentially to have the Leipzig summit as a milestone within that process. Where are we on the comprehensive agreement on investment? And there's a question related to that also in terms of whether this is a contradiction to the issue of reshoring we've just been discussing. Fraser, where do you see the comprehensive agreement on investment, and are we going to make progress?
It reminds me of your favorite topic, Fabian, Brexit, deal or no deal. I think that it's finely balanced. I think there's going to be another round later this month where allegedly China will make an improved offer on market access. I think the conditions are well known. There has to be some progress here if there's going to be a rescheduled summit, which I think the Merkel would like to see before the end of the year under the German presidency. But the German and the EU position that it's not going to be any kind of deal. It has to be a deal that satisfies both sides here. But the name of the game is slightly changed because, I mean, who would have thought? I mean, one of the central issues is, of course, state subsidies. And you just look at what has happened in Europe, and conservative governments around Europe are pouring vast amounts of state money into enterprises to keep them afloat here. So it's becoming rather an interesting situation to define, you know, what these subsidies are and how long they might last here. So will there be a deal? I think it's 50-50 at the moment. I think ultimately China probably has to assess, do we really want to have a big trade war with Europe as well as the United States? And I think if I was in Beijing, I'd say, let's cut a deal with the European Union. We'll see.
Q, how does it look from the Chinese side? Is this something where we are going to see a significantly improved offer, or is it seen very differently in Beijing?
Yes, I think, yes, it's okay, yes. So I think for this issue in China, we understand that you mentioned the comprehensive investment agreement. Usually we call it the BIT. The BIT negotiation is also a big concern from the, I think, from Chinese side, and also to some degree, especially this year, as we know, because Germany proposed this 27+1 summit between China and all of the member states of the European Union. It looks like it has been connected, I mean, between this BIT negotiation and the summit between China and the EU. So that's the reason why we got the news that postpone of the summit, which means that yes, now we do have some barriers on this negotiation. I think now for China, maybe three problem is firstly, because now we are facing a pandemic crisis. So now for China, for its economy, maybe to keep the stability and also try to get positive growth for GDP will be a very, very big priority. So once there will be some BIT negotiation, which means that China have to have some more resources for reforming its economic structure and even, I mean, the law structure. So I think now the question is, how could China to deal with the tensions between more reform and I mean the stability of the GDP growth? Another, I think, the Chinese concern is how about the European Union side? And indeed, I think the European Union now facing the same problem, is to keep the balance is, yes, get some more reform for Eurozone and for some other, but at the same time to keep the GDP growth even not so bad as some estimation. So the question is, for China maybe now is afraid of there will be more asking price from the European Union side, and some more pressures on China, including some very, very big issue, including the state-owned companies, I mean the state aid, and also the so-called technology transfer issue, some other. I think that some of these issues is not technical or just an investment issue. To some degree, they are a kind of a political issue in China. So I think it will give some more difficulties for China to make decision. The third is, I think there will be some always American factor. As we know now, China and the US, we do have the first phase, trade negotiation, and then now once there is a second phase negotiation between China and the US, how could China to deal with this relations between the BIT negotiation with the European Union and maybe the potential negotiation with the United States? But of course, now we got some messages from President Trump that he is not interested in the negotiation with China about the second phase of the trade issue. I think that maybe there will be some more opportunities for China-EU negotiation on this investment once there are more barriers between China and the US on the second phase negotiation.
Thanks. Turning to both of you, Fraser and Maaike, in terms of how do you think that the European public sees cooperation with China at the moment? I'm also thinking about if we do make progress on the investment treaty, how likely is it that this will be accepted by the public, by the parliament? Is that something we should be concerned about? Don't know which one of you wants to come in.
Ladies first. Maaike?
Well, in all honesty, I don't know much about public perception of this specific the economic deal with China. But of course, we see also in Europe more of a hardening perceptions. So that, well, might not be a positive sign. At the same time, I wonder if the EU, with the more defensive measures that it's also been taking, could get to an agreement with China. There might be sufficient support, I think, from the public to take that forward. But this is really my worry in these negotiations, because they've been ongoing for 7 years, and we've seen over and over the same issues returning, and over time, the longer it has taken, sort of well, at least seen from the European side, for China to deliver on some of the real core considerations or requests of Europe, the longer it takes and the less, as we see that nothing much is being delivered, the more defensive measures the EU is also taking. And I think that's a bad sign also to China. So the investment screening process that is now in place, export controls that we are considering, there's a whole lot of defensive measures that the EU is now considering with its member states that were totally taboo even just 5 years ago. And I see that as a negative consequence, and perhaps the focus shift of focus of the EU. And personally, I see that as part of the realization of the EU that, well, if in bilateral context this is not moving, we have to do our homework, as you could say. So take those defensive measures, but this is only well, it's not the default option or the preference of the EU as such.
I agree with Maaike here. I think that the EU has been forced, mainly by the business community, to consider these defensive measures after many years of frustration in terms of the negotiations to open up the Chinese market. Now, it's not black and white. The Chinese market is still a big market. Many European companies are making good profits there, so they're not going to walk away from it. And of course, the EU is the biggest market for China too. The deal would simply put in place a more solid basis for expanding the trade relations and moving it on to a new phase. And that's why I think it really is important for both sides. And a quick word on public opinion. I think it varies around the EU. I think in some countries, the Chinese wolf warrior diplomats have been very counterproductive. I mean, if I look at how public opinion has changed in Sweden, for example, or Czech Republic, or even France, it's not really been very helpful the way some of the Chinese diplomats have behaved. So perhaps this is a lesson to be learned.
Maybe the same question with a slight different twist to you. How is Europe seen in China at this moment? There's the big rivalry between the US and China. Of course, Europe plays a role, but is it important in public perception? Do you see Europe as a core partner going forward?
Certainly, I think more and more, I think, of course, because maybe we can find a different understanding in China from some, for example, some companies, they have investment or they have business in Europe, and some, average people. For average people, maybe for them, yes, now US become a very, very big problem for China. At the same time, that of course, always European countries played a more, I mean, firstly, soft and a more favorable image in China. Regarding to some economic issue and even lifestyle, certainly European countries are very, very, popular in China. But now the question is, maybe for some companies or for some investors in China, maybe they're afraid of the, a kind of similarity between European countries and the United States. Yesterday or even today, very, very hot issue in China is the UK government banned Huawei in its market. So for most of the Chinese people, they think, oh yes, the UK and the United States, they are the same thing. They are the same country. They are the same mindset. Maybe they both of them just regard China as a rival like that. And even maybe some people will worry about, yes, maybe some more European countries will follow the way of the UK and to follow the way of the United States like that. And another issue is recently you can find out more and more maybe consensus or maybe more words from some senior officials of the United States. For example, Mr. Pompeo said, okay, now we are teaming up and to fight against with China and so on. So what will you do? I mean, for European side, for European countries, I think now it's a very, very critical time for China and the EU, for China and the European countries to understand, yes, European side need to find out its position in the competition between China and the US. And also, I think China will support this kind of effort from European side, especially European Union, to develop its strategic autonomy, everything. But now the question is, how could the European Union side to understand, this difficult issue, especially with China? Now recently we can find a tougher and tougher, declaration from European Union about the Hong Kong issue, about some other issue. Yes, I think just like a European Union strengthened that, yes, European Union, European will be more assertive. The assertiveness used to be a definition from European side on China, say that, okay, China become more assertive. So now the question is, how could China and the European Union to get along with each other once two sides become more assertive? So what's the target of assertiveness? I think that's a very important thing for us to make some more understanding.
Thanks. You just mentioned Hong Kong, and we've also had a couple of questions on that. Maybe I'll give this to Fraser. One of the questions from Joe Linen is, how should the EU react to the Hong Kong Security Act?
Well, the EU has already had extensive discussions. It was brought up at the summit, both with President Xi and also Prime Minister Li, and the EU position was made quite clear, and also came up last week in the Foreign Affairs Council. I don't think the EU is going to go down the road of sort of economic sanctions that the United States has announced, although I think, in fact, they're not going to bring really any improvement in the situation. I mean, sanctions as regards Hong Kong is a very difficult road to follow. I think a more smart policy would be to try and do what the EU is considering just now in terms of easing the situation, offering more scholarships for Hong Kong activists who want to come to the EU, mulling over how to extend long-term visas, etc. At the same time, I think people also ought just to stop and think how this is seen from the Chinese side. Not that I'm defending what has been happening lately, but for 150 years, this was a colony of the UK, which did not introduce democracy, which had no real regard for human rights. And so from a Chinese perspective, they're coming along and saying, well, isn't it a little bit hypocritical, all this sudden interest in democracy and human rights, when for 150 years you had the chance and you didn't do it. So I think it is important to try and see it. For the Chinese, this is their territory, sovereignty is at fault here, and they really don't want anybody interfering in it. At the same time, I think they have perhaps lost some trust in terms of the agreement that was signed between China and Britain in 1984, and that of course affects the Chinese image, what we were talking about earlier.
Maaike, of course, please react to whatever you want to react to, but I also wanted to come back to this decision in the UK, and that we now have a 5G decision which is much more close to the US than it has been to the overall consensus within the European Union. Do you see the stance also shifting in the European Union, or will the EU maintain the slightly less restrictive approach which has been there up to now?
Well, I think the EU toolkit for 5G that was introduced a while ago, that already encouraged all member states to have a close look at all providers and to have a more subtle, perhaps, way of excluding the ones that they might not trust. So in that sense, I think the EU has been quite clear in where it stands. It all depends on what the different member states are going to do and whether that leads to a sort of a unified policy, because in the end, for the EU to and the member states to speak more clearly, to have a similar message to China, not speak with one voice, but have a similar message, I think is important. But clearly in this field, it's been very difficult to achieve for obvious reasons, because different member states have different interests in their relationship with China, and they're at different stages of development themselves, and may or have more financial leeway in certain member states than others. So for the UK now to say that Huawei should be phased out, I believe by 2027, that requires quite an investment financially, and the UK is willing and able to apparently to do that now, whereas other member states might not. At the same time, I think, again, the more fundamental underlying question here is what are we talking about? Is this really a question of national security concerns or economic competition? I think most people, at least in my country, in the Netherlands, agree that what the United States is doing is also part of the economic rivalry with China, and that should not be a reason for us to follow whatever the United States is requesting us to do, including on 5G. But there are some genuine national security concerns arising, and that is increasingly be taken serious. Even in my own country, where the open markets have traditionally, of course, been held in very high regard, and I still think that again we are not shifting on that position, but we are adding this new attention to national security. So that's another sort of irritant, I think, it's going to be in EU-China relations. And it is, to my mind, again, coming back to what I said initially, a reason to have more bilateral dialogue, not just at the formal level, at the highest between policymakers, but also facilitated by track 1.5 sort of dialogues between Chinese and European think tanks that might be able to smoothen some of the difficult debates and to broaden or to deepen mutual understanding, because that I think is also still very much lacking, not just of a lack of understanding in Europe of China, but also, well, the very relatively limited number of EU or European experts in Chinese think tanks compared to, for example, the ones that are working on the United States. And of course, we have a very great exception to that here in our panel today. So I'm very happy.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end, so I want to finish on time. So I want to give each one of you a chance to say a couple of final words, of course, reacting to anything which has been said before, but also just to maybe give an indication of where you expect the EU-China relationship to be in maybe towards the end of the year. Are we going to make progress? There was this big expectation that the German presidency would result in a step change in the relationship between the EU and China. Is that going to happen? So a very broad question, but I'll start with Fraser and then I'll go in the same order as before.
I think there's a reasonable chance. I think Merkel would like to cement a deal with China as part of her legacy. So although I would still rate the chances less than 50%, I think, you know, there's a good possibility that we may have a summit at the end of the year, as Merkel had wanted. I think the relationship overall will be more hard-nosed, more looking at the essential interests of each other. At the same time, I want to just reinforce what Maaike said. There must be far greater attention in Europe to understanding China. I mean, it should start in schools and universities as well as think tanks. China is going to be an important partner for the EU, however we describe it, over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And the better we understand China, the better chance we have of actually forming a coherent policy towards China.
Yes, I do believe now we are in a very crucial time to, firstly, just like people mentioned, now maybe because of the pandemic, there will be an issue of reset, maybe some new situations, some relations. Maybe to some degree, China and the EU, we are going into a new normal for these relations. Not only because of the you know, some change of the you know, cooperation and the competition, and also because of the big change of the international order. So how could we find out the way to deal with, find out the, I mean, connection between the traditional cooperation and the new normal situation? And then yes, I think that there will be more how to say expectations on the presidency of Germany in the second half of this year. But we need to try also find out a balance between how big consensus on this BIT negotiation and how could we estimate the China-EU relations, especially China-EU strategic partnership, and just because of the BIT negotiation. And because I think that what does it mean for strategic partnership, which means just a long-term and comprehensive, not only because of the BIT negotiation. It's just a single, maybe yes, it would be very, very important, but it would not be the all of the strategic partnership between two sides.
Thank you. Maaike?
Yes, well, nothing all too much to add to what I said and what Fraser and you've just been saying. Perhaps just to reinforce again, I think, well, if you cannot solve certain problems, broaden them, as what a wise person many years ago said. That might also should be taken serious in EU-China relations. So broaden the discussion to some of the more newer issues, including in the digital field, as I said. Broaden also by including, well, adding some oil to the discussion, not to add flames, but to smoothen the discussion, and look also at what's happening in third countries. I think it was almost 5 years ago that the Chinese premier in Europe said that we should be looking at third country cooperation. That has been sort of well, it's difficult something to understand or to follow on, because he was, I think, speaking about third country cooperation in Europe. But look at third countries in the rings around Europe, in Eastern European countries, Central Asia, in Africa, where stability is very much high on the agenda of Europe, and trying to look for more cooperation there. I think that would be a good addition to broadening EU-China ties.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've come to the end of the hour, and there are still many topics I think we could have deepened or even touched upon. One issue, for example, we haven't touched upon is cooperation on climate change, which continues to be a very important topic. But I'm sure we'll return to that. The EU-China relationship will remain a very important relationship for both sides, but also globally. So it is certainly something we will continue to follow at the EPC, and we will also continue our think tank dialogue, where we have been cooperating with CIIS and the EU Asia Center for a very long time now, and this is certainly one of those avenues of dialogue, which I think is extremely helpful. So thank you to all the panelists for taking part. Thank you to the audience. I'm sorry I didn't manage to go through all of the questions, but I think we've covered most of the topics. But I hope to welcome you again very soon at an EPC event. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.